Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is our class for Thursday, December 2nd, where I wanted to finish up with Raisin in the Sun and also begin talking about poetry. But first, I wanted to draw your attention to some of the upcoming due dates. So as you can see, that journal number 2 drama is now due today, if you're watching this on the 2nd of December, Thursday, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, rulers@gcc.mass.edu. So I gave a little bit of an extension. As well, I did the same with paper number 2, which would be on drama, 11:59 p.m. due on the 16th of December. That's a Thursday. It's also our last day of class. Via PDF to Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I gave a small extension for journal number 3, poetry. So that will be due on Friday the 17th at 11:59 p.m. That'll give you 24 hours from the last class in which we discussed poetry to write your poetry journal. And what you're doing with your poetry journal is similar to what you did with your drama and what you did with your short story. I'm just asking you to devote about a page or so. In this instance, for the poetry journal, for 3 of the poems in the poetry unit that we would have been covering. And our final exam is scheduled, and this was by the college, on Monday, the 20th, at 3:30 p.m. So that's when I will make the final exam available. Normally, if we were taking this in class, we would have approximately 2 hours for that final. Instead, since we aren't taking it in class, I'm giving you 24 hours to complete that final exam. It's open book, open notes. So I don't expect it to be as neat or as polished as any assignment that you would do at home. However, I am hopeful that you are able to talk about the poetry. And the bulk of the exam, 80 points, will be about poetry. What I'm going to do is select a handful of poems from our poetry section and ask you to choose 2 and analyze, or a word that we will soon be talking about, explicate those poems, talking about anything and everything that seems to be important. So that's the bulk of the final, with 20 points left over. 10 points would be for short story, where I'll give you a couple of questions and ask you to choose one about your thoughts in relation to short story. And same thing in terms of drama for 10 points, and that gives you your 100 points. But the focus is on poetry because we would not have had a chance to write a paper on poetry. So as we are finishing up finally A Raisin in the Sun, there were some quotes that I wanted to draw your attention to. On page 38, at least of the particular version that I am using, this is when Walter and Beneatha are arguing with one another early on in the play, and Walter says to her, "Who the hell told you you had to be a doctor? If you so crazy about messing around with sick people, then go be a nurse like other women, or just get married and be quiet." And obviously, that's a good indicator of the time period in which this particular play is occurring. And I had also, I believe, referenced that the film doesn't necessarily give us all of the elements that the written drama does. And one of those happens to be with Travis outdoors playing with rats. And for me, that's on page 58. And this is when Beneatha and Ruth are arguing about the possibility that Ruth could have another child and where would that child be. And then suddenly, this is in the stage directions, there's a sudden commotion from the street, and Beneatha goes to the window to look out. What on earth is going on out there, these kids? And there are, she throws open the window, the shouts of children rising up from the street. She sticks her head out to see better and calls out, "Travis, Travis, what are you doing down there?" And then she sees, "Oh Lord, they're tracing a rat." And then Travis comes upstairs all excited and says, "Mama, you should have seen the rat. Big as a cat, honest." And he shows an exaggerated size with his hands. "Golly, the rat was really cutting, and Bubba caught him with his heel, and the janitor, Mr. Bartlett, got him with a stick, and then they got him in a corner, and bam, bam, bam. And he was just jumping around and bleeding like everything, too. And there's rat blood all over the street." And, of course, this illustrates the dire situation that they are in, that they need to leave no matter what. And on page 74 of my version, Mom and Walter are talking about the insurance money. And basically, Mama asks, how come you talk so much about money? She asks Walter. And he says, because it's life, Mama. And she says, oh, so now it's life. Money is life. Once upon a time, freedom used to be life. Now it's money. I guess the world really do change. And Walter says, no, it was always, Mama, about money. We just didn't know it. And she says, no, something's changed. You something new, boy. In my time, we was worried about not being lynched. Getting to the north if we could. How to stay alive and stuff a pinch of dignity, too. Now, here come you and Benitha talking about things we ain't never even thought about, hardly, me and your daddy. You ain't satisfied or proud of nothing we done. I mean that you had a home, that we kept you out of trouble till you was grown, that you didn't have to ride or work on the back of nobody's streetcar. You my children, but how different we become. And of course, we see a transformation in Walter when he realizes that money is not necessarily the meaning of life by the ending of the play. On page 97, this is where we're basically told a bit about, well, actually on page 83, I'll begin there. This is where we're told a little bit about Benitha's boyfriend, George Murchison, and he's talking a little bit with the family. And Walter confronts Murchison and says, why all you college boys got to wear them faggoty-looking white shoes? That's page 83. And not only is this obviously greatly politically incorrect, but note the color imagery of white shoes, since this play is about black and white and the conflict between the two. And then eventually Murchison says to Walter what he believes is the purpose of school, which has very little to do with learning, and that instead, he says, you read books to learn facts, to get grades, to pass the course, to get a degree. That's all. School has nothing to do with thoughts. Of course, Benitha is horrified by this. This is on page 97. Perhaps one of the most important episodes is on page 104, where we are introduced to the character of Mrs. Johnson, who is not included in many of the productions. And I talked a little bit about Mrs. Johnson and the significance of her particular name. But it's kind of interesting just sort of seeing the dialogue. For me, it begins on page 102. And Mrs. Johnson comes in and basically says, you know, Benny, she act like she ain't got time to pass the time of day with nobody, ain't been to college. I ain't criticizing her none. It's just, well, you know how some of our young peoples gets when they get a little education. Well, I better get on home. And the stage direction is unmoving. Of course, I can understand how she must be proud and everything, being the only one in the family to make something of herself. I know just being a chauffeur ain't never satisfied brother none. He shouldn't feel like that, though. Ain't nothing wrong with being a chauffeur. And Mama says that there's plenty of things being wrong with a chauffeur, and that a man's hands was made to make things or turn the earth with, not to drive nobody's car for him. And Mrs. Johnson says, the youngers is too much for me. You sure are one proud acting bunch of colored folks. Well, I always think like Booker T. Washington said that time, education has spoiled many a good plow hand. And Mama says, is that what Booker T. said? And Johnson says, sure did. Mama says, well, it sounds just like him, the fool. And Johnson says, well, he was one of our great men. And Mama says, who said so? And Johnson says, you know, me and you ain't never agreed on some things. I guess I better get going. Ruth says quickly, good night. And Johnson says, good night. And thrusts the paper at them, because that was really her purpose for coming, was to let them know what the headline happens to be of the paper. And she says, I bet this time next month, all names will be in the paper plenty. Holding up her hands to mark off each word of the headline, she can see in front of her, Negroes invade Clybourne Park. Bombs. And of course, Mama says that that isn't why they are moving out there. And keep in mind that just previously on page 99, Mrs. Johnson says that she was so happy for all of them. But that's not true. And even in the stage directions, and think about the challenges for the actor. This is a woman who decided long ago to be enthusiastic about everything in life. And she's inclined to wave her wrist vigorously at the height of her exclamatory comments. And, of course, she is too overfamiliar with Ruth and pets her stomach or pats her stomach, and basically says that, Walter's a handsome man and where is he? And yeah, they're spending time making babies. And of course, all of this is inappropriate. And that while Mrs. Johnson says she can hardly stay a minute, of course, she's dropping hints so that they would basically give her her midnight coffee. So all of this gives you an idea why it is that ultimately Benita would say when Mrs. Johnson leaves on page 104, Mama, if there are two things we as the people have got to overcome, one is the Ku Klux Klan, the other is Mrs. Johnson. And I did want you to also note that Miss Johnson makes a comment about Benny, who is running quickly to the bathroom. And this is something that's repeated over and over again in the play, this rush to go to the bathroom. Understand that in the building in which they are living, they do not have their own bathroom. So multiple families on a floor are sharing one bathroom, which is why there is so much competition for the bathroom. Again, illustrating the importance of the Youngers getting their own residence so that they could finally have a bathroom for their family, not have to share it with other families as well. Walter on page 108, 109 talks a little bit about his dreams, and I think that this is important because it shows that he's thinking a little bit more than about himself. This is when he asks Travis what Travis wants to do when he becomes an adult, and Travis says a bus driver, and Walter says that ain't nothing to want to be. And he continues on and says, you know what, Travis? In 7 years, you're going to be 17 years old. Things are going to be very different with us in 17 years, Travis. One day when you're 17, I'll come home from my office downtown somewhere. And you wouldn't understand yet, son, but your daddy's going to make a business transaction that's going to change our lives. That's how come when one day you're about 17 years old, I'll come home. I'll be pretty tired, with what I mean, with a day conferences and secretaries getting things wrong the way they do. Because an executive's life is hell, man. And I'll pull the car up on the driveway. Just a plain black Chrysler, I think, with white walls. No, black tires, more elegant. Rich people don't have to be flashy. They'll have to get something a little sportier for Ruth. Maybe a Cadillac convertible to do her shopping in. I'll come up the steps to the house, and the gardener will be clipping away at the hedges, and he'll say, good evening, Mr. Younger. And I'll say, hello, Jefferson, how are you this evening? And I'll go inside, and Ruth will come downstairs and meet me at the door. We'll kiss each other. She'll take my arm. We'll go up to your room to see you sitting on the floor with the catalogs of all the great schools in America around you. All the great schools. And I'll say, all right, son, it's your 17th birthday. What is it you decided? Just tell me where you want to go to school, and you'll go. And just tell me what you want to be, and you'll be it. Whatever you want to be, just name it, son, and I hand you the world. Which makes Walter a little bit more of an empathetic kind of character. On page 118, this is when the welcoming committee comes to see the family. And Benita makes a snide comment to Littner that he's offering 30 pieces and not a coin less. That's a biblical reference to the money that was paid to Judas to betray Jesus. On page 121, what I've always thought one of the most important quotes is when ultimately Benita, Mama, and Ruth are talking about why it is that the community had to send out the, quote, welcoming committee, unquote. What are they so afraid of? And Benita says, and this is for me on page 121, what do they think we're going to do, eat them? And Ruth says, no, honey, marry them. And that says a great deal about some of the cultural anxieties about bloodlines, and that is helping to fuel much of the racism during this time period. Mama talks a little bit about her plan on page 121 and even says that the plan expresses her. And what a great way to examine this play by sort of examining the plant and its importance. On page 132, Benita talks a little bit about her dreams. And while we talked about Benita being someone we could admire, but also someone who could be seen as selfish, I think her dreams definitely give her a more positive sense. Me is what she says to Asagai. I'm nothing. And when I was small, we used to take our sleds, this is on page 132, out in the wintertime, and the only hills we had were this ice-covered stone steps of some houses down the street. You used to fill them in with snow and make them smooth and slide down them all day. It was very dangerous, far too steep. And sure enough, one day, a kid named Rufus Came down too fast and hit the sidewalk, and we saw his face split wide open right there in front of us. And I remember standing there looking at his bloody open face thinking, well, that was the ending of Rufus. But the ambulance came and they took him to the hospital and they fixed the broken bones and they sewed it all up. The next time I saw Rufus, he had just a little line down the middle of his face. And I never got over that. That was what one person could do for another. Fix him up. Sew up the problems. Make him all right again. I wanted to do that. I always thought it was the one thing in the world that a human being could do, to fix the sick and make them whole again. Of course, she's picking a profession that comes with a good amount of status and money, but this gives a very different sense as to why she wants to be a doctor. And we learn from Asagai about how he perceives the youngers on page 135 when he says, Isn't there something wrong in a house, in a world where all dreams, good or bad, must depend on the death of a man? I never thought to see you like this, Elia. Your brother made a mistake and you're grateful to him so that now you can give up the ailing human race on account of it? And where are we all going and why are we all bothering? And Benita says, and you cannot answer it. And he says, I live the answer. In my village at home, it's the exceptional man who can even read a newspaper, whoever sees a book at all. I'll go home and much of what I will have to say will seem strange to the people in my village, but I'll teach and work and things will happen slowly and swiftly. At times it will seem that nothing changes, and then again the sudden dramatic events which make history leap into the future. Then quiet again, retrogression even, guns, murder, revolution. And I even will have moments where I wonder if the quiet was not better than all that death and hatred. But I will look about my village at the illiteracy and disease and ignorance, and I will not wonder long. Perhaps I'll be a great man. Perhaps I will hold on to the substance of truth and find my way always with the right course. And perhaps for it I will be butchered in my bed some night by the servants of the empire. Or perhaps I'll live to be a very old man, respected and esteemed in my nation. Perhaps I shall hold office, and this is what I'm trying to tell you, Elia. Perhaps the things I believe now for my country will be wrong and outmoded, and I will not understand and do terrible things to have things my way, or merely to keep my power. Don't you see there will be young men and women, not British soldiers, but my own black countrymen, to step out of the shadows some evening and slit my then useless throat? Don't you see they've always been there, and they always will, and that such a thing as my own death will be in advance? They who might kill me even might actually replenish what I was. And of course, the highlight of the play is Walter's transformation on page 148. And this is where Walter is able to tell Lintner that they will not be accepting the money because their pride is more important than any amount of money. And Walter says on page 147, we're a very plain people. And my father, he was a laborer for most of his life. And my father, he almost beat a man to death once because that man called him a bad name or something. You know what I mean? And Walter continues on with Lintner and says, what I mean is that we come from people who have a lot of pride. We're very proud people. And that's my sister over there, and she's going to be a doctor. Can you imagine the difference of the early Walter, who wanted to know why she couldn't just get married? And now, sister is a doctor, and we're very proud. And we've decided, and and he goes on, what I'm telling you is that we called you over here to tell you that we're very proud. And this, Travis, come here. And Travis gets closer. This is my son. He makes the 6th generation our family is in this country. We've all thought about your offer, and we've decided to move into our house because my father, he earned it for us, brick by brick. We don't want to make no trouble for nobody or fight no causes. And we'll try to be good neighbors, and that's all we've got to say about that. Again, it's not about making a statement. It's about doing what's best for his family, which I think that most readers and viewers of this drama can understand. And of course, the very ending when Mama takes the plant, that plant being so important. Before that, she warns the movers, to be careful with the furniture. That ain't no bale of cotton, she says. And those days are over where the youngers would be basically moving bales of cotton. They've moved on from the times of slavery. So that's A Raisin in the Sun. And I have suggested that all three of these plays have contemporary relevance, but I suspect that A Raisin in the Sun probably has the most contemporary relevance. Um, that said, I look forward to reading your journals and eventually your papers about whichever of the three dramas you choose: Oedipus the King, A Midsummer Night's Dream, or ultimately A Raisin in the Sun. As we move on to poetry, our very last unit, the good news is that we've been dabbling in poetry for a while, so in some ways this isn't completely new. What is poetry? There is no neat or tidy or clear definition of poetry. I know that in some ways the definition of pornography is very similar to the definition of poetry, in that you know it when you see it, but outside of that, it's very difficult to articulate what it is. It often utilizes sounds. So things like rhyme, where you've got the endings of words with similar sounds, or you've got alliteration, where the beginnings of words have similar sounds, or you've got meter, a kind of beat. We do know that poetry, more often than not, is shorter than short story and drama, but not necessarily always. Poetry is quite dense and compact. We know that that's true of all literature, but especially poetry. And the shorter it is, the more dense it is, which means that everything matters. And we know that oftentimes poetry can break grammatical conventions. That's not to say that couldn't happen in short story or in drama as well, but that oftentimes is the expectation for poetry. And that poetry examines emotional states. But again, I think that that too is not necessarily a satisfactory answer, because I'd say that short story and drama has also, or I also examines emotional states. That's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, is what do you think your definition of poetry is? And certainly you can look up definitions, but I'm very curious to see your perspective about poetry and what you think makes something a piece of poetry. On page 589 of our textbook, it talks a little bit about reading poetry responsively. To read it out loud, it's very musical. In fact, if you are familiar with lyrics of a song, then that's probably something that's very similar to what you're going to find with many poetic forms. So you should listen to the sound. The difference between a song, perhaps, and a poem is that a song not only has somebody singing, but usually has accompaniment with musical instruments. But imagine if that person were just reading the lyrics without singing them and not having the musical instruments. That's not to say that there isn't a beat that's embedded in there. It's just more difficult for you to be able to identify that without the singing and the musical instruments. And that's basically what poetry is. And some poetry is good and some poetry is bad, just like some songs are good and some songs are bad, their lyrics. And that ultimately, just like we've talked about with short story and drama, that we hope that there's a depth and a complexity there, that it's not too formulaic or too predictable. And when we talk about the pleasure of words on page 593 to 596, it talks a little bit about how you need to go through a poem if it's well written in the same way you would do with a short story or drama. You need to annotate, you need to take notes, you need to read critically, you need to reread, and there's a term that we use in poetry called explicate that I had mentioned earlier. And it sounds a lot like the word explanation. The idea when you are explicating a poem is that you are analyzing that poem, but you are analyzing every element that you can. So you are looking at that poem line by line, word by word, literally piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, and deciding why those elements exist and why other elements don't exist. And the recommendation when you're working with a poem is 3 readings, which is something that I've recommended over the course of the semester for all literature, but especially for poetry, because poetry is so dense and compact. And if you think about the difficulty of trying to articulate an emotional state, I mean, we know what it feels like to feel happy or sad, but the dictionary definition of happiness and sadness is very flat compared to the experiencing of the emotion. And I'd say that poetry gets a lot closer to our feelings of the emotion than a prose dictionary definition could. And that if you're going to do 3 readings, the first reading you're doing merely to try to get a sense as to what the poem is about. So this is a good place where you can paraphrase, to try to put in your own language what the main points are of the poem. Then the second reading is when you can explicate. That's an extremely detailed analysis. And then finally, the third reading is when ultimately you are going through that poem and you're getting prepared to talk about it or to write about it. On page 606, there are a list of suggestions for how to approach poetry. Many of these suggestions are similar sorts of suggestions that we've talked about for drama and short story. So assume it's necessary to read the poem more than once. Pay attention to that title. As you read the poem for the first time, don't become entangled in lines or words you don't understand. Instead, give yourself a chance to take in the entire poem before attempting to resolve the problems encountered along the way. On a second reading, identify words or passages that you don't understand. And while this is important in all of your reading, it's especially important in poetry because poetry is oftentimes so short. Read the poem out loud or have somebody else read it to you. And if you've ever gone to a poetry reading, then you know that there is a certain element of performance associated with readings. Different people will read the poems different ways. And as we continue on in the semester, we will get to the point where we actually have some audio of the authors themselves reading their own poems. And again, we can talk a little bit, not just about the poem, but about the reading of the poem. Just because they wrote the poem, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are reading it as well as they could. It's much like a screenwriter writing dialogue for a movie. That screenwriter may not necessarily be able to act out the role as well as another actor may. It depends on a whole host of elements. Read the punctuation because punctuations are important. So if you see a pause, take that pause. It's important if you see a comma. Paraphrase, try to put in your own words. Try to get a sense of who's speaking. It doesn't necessarily have to be the poet. Assume that each element in the poem has a purpose. Again, the shorter it is, the more important each element is. Be generous. Be willing to entertain different perspectives, values, experiences, and subjects. Try developing a coherent approach to examining a poem. So we began the semester talking about critical approaches for reading, viewing something from, let's say, a historical perspective or a biographical perspective or psychological perspective. And don't necessarily expect a definitive reading. Now, one of the poems that is in our textbook, and this is on page 595, is a poem called Uh-Oh. And I wanted to draw your attention to this particular poem, if for no other reason. You can see that a reader has gone through and has written annotations, notes on the side of things that have occurred to them that might have importance, whether it be the title or specific use of language or use of punctuation. And all of that is what you should be doing when you are going through poetry. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the distinction between formulaic poetry and poetry that has more depth and more sophistication. And I had suggested perhaps some lyrics of pop songs are more formulaic. And if you aren't necessarily familiar with pop songs, perhaps you are familiar with things like greeting cards, which oftentimes will utilize poetry, but on the simplest of levels. And that is in direct contrast to the kind of poetry that we will be reading, literary poetry, that has a depth and a sophistication to it. And I thought that we could talk about that next class, as well as talking a little bit about scanning a poem, which means going through a poem and identifying its characteristics in terms of rhyme. Is there some sort of a pattern? And also in terms of meter or some sort of a beat. So we could do that as well. And if you notice that there is one poem that is included in the opening section of readings, this is on page 596. It's entitled Catch. And I wanted just to end by reading this poem to you so that you can think about the idea of reading a poem multiple times and trying to come up with a multiplicity of meaning. Robert Francis, who was born in 1901 and died in 1987. Catch, which was written in 1950. Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree in the long sweet cadence down, over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Now the paraphrase is underneath that. It's written in complete sentence of what this poem says. A poet's relationship to a reader is similar to a game of catch. The poem, like a ball, should be pitched in a variety of ways to challenge and create interest. Boredom and predictability must be avoided as the game is to be engaging and satisfying. But how flat is that compared to the actual poem? When we get in the first line, two boys uncoached, right then and there, we can do some analysis. Two, and that basically is the importance of the reader and also the writer of poetry. Boys, in terms of youth, that anybody can engage in reading and writing poetry. Boys, that it oftentimes is something that would have been viewed as male-centric, especially in the time this poem was written, 1950. Think about how much I've said just about the first three words. As they're tossing a poem together, much like they're tossing a ball. And you could think about a game can be pleasurable, but also can involve a lot of exertion and can also have lots of high stakes too. And then in the second line, overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Notice the repetition of hands. That's what you do when you write a poem. It's also what you should do when you read. You should take notes with your hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. And maybe that's what poetry is it teases you. You're going to have to work for it. And notice all the similar sounds, attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him scoop. The idea that this is basic, or make him stoop. This is what you do with a ball, is that you try to throw it in different ways to be able to give a challenge to the catcher. Same thing with the poem, is that it's not going to be easily decipherable. The meaning is going to be hidden, and you're going to have to work to try to find the meaning. Make him scoop it up, make him almost as possible miss it. In other words, that the whole point of the poet is, and just the person who's throwing the ball, is to make the reader or the catcher work and may not necessarily be successful. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Maybe that's what poetry is trying to do, to fool us. Anything, everything. Maybe that's what poetry is. Anything and everything. Tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. And that's basically what poetry is. It's to try to outwit. Over the tree in the long sweet cadence down. And cadence is about sounds. You know, a ball in the air can make a sound, but certainly poetry is musical, can make a sound. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. Keep that in mind as we begin our poetry section, that we are going to be scrambling to try to pick up the meaning. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Notice all those P sounds. Posy, pretty, plump. And of course, the word poetry starts with the P too. So I just use that as an example of how we could go through and begin to analyze a poem. We'll actually do this next class. As I said, I wanted to compare and contrast a formulaic poem and then compare it with something that has a little bit more depth and sophistication. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the conventions of scanning a poem, being able to identify patterns in rhyme or in beat. And then we'll begin by actually reading some poems. I also wanted to note that, and you can see this in the notes below, that I have the flyer for my horror film class, which I will be teaching next semester. So if any of you are fans of horror film, that's CMN 201. That's meaning Wednesdays, 6 to 8:50. And if you'll remember, I was giving a presentation at the Lava Center in downtown Greenfield about horror film, and that was recorded. I gave the presentation shortly before Halloween, and that should be ready fairly soon. It's just being edited now so that I can post that if it turns out that it's something that you want to view on your own. It also gives you a good idea what my class is about, too, in horror film. So again, for today's attendance question, which would be due on Friday, December 3rd at 10 a.m., what is your personal definition of poetry? What is your personal definition of poetry and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.